A question and matter that I'm almost certain we will be encountering more and more frequently in the coming years is the matter of voice acting in CRPGs. Now, I'm specifically stating CRPGs here for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is when it comes to action games or action RPGs, it's very obvious that the characters are going to be voiced. So you can think of, for example, the recent games in God of War, or even the older God of War games where you also had voice characters. Think of Mass Effect. Think of Horizon Zero Dawn. I mean, the list is pretty long and endless, to be perfectly honest. No, here we're talking specifically about CRPGs, because the concept of everything being voiced for characters, and in general, all content being voiced in a CRPG, is pretty damn novel, all things considered. And yet, by the looks of it, or based on what we've heard thus far, Owlcat is in fact planning on doing this in Dark Heresy. The question is to what extent. It will be significantly more voiced over than Rogue Trader, and if we can believe what we've heard, I think everything is going to be voiced. At least I think so. Now this raises some interesting questions, not least of which because in my recent video about Dark Heresy, there were a number of people, not too many, but a number of people who commented on their wish, their desire for Dark Heresy to be voiced in its totality. And this is not the first time. I've seen many comments over the years regarding Owlcat games and specifically CRPGs. And there seems to be a trend that people are pushing for when it comes to CRPGs, namely, they want the characters in CRPGs to be voiced almost universally, or so it would seem. Because in opposition, you have other voices as well. And I myself, as you might expect, find myself somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, you have the pro-voiceover people. Now, I totally get this, because voiced-over games where all dialogue is captured by a voice actor is basically the industry standard when it comes to all AAA games. Now, it just so happens that CRPGs are basically not really AAA category games to begin with the only exception I can think of being, of course, Baldur's Gate 3, which is a can of worms in and of itself. But if there is an industry standard, it's not unreasonable to expect the games that you play to conform to that standard. And of course, there's an added argument there as well. Look, I totally relate to it. Generally, I don't mind reading in games, but sometimes you've been working on a given day, you're tired, or you've been reading other things, say a book or things for your employment or whatever it might be, and then you have to dive into what's effectively a novel, which I have to say, Rogue Trader is in a nutshell, then yes, you're going to quickly lose your desire to engage because you're exhausted, you're tired from reading elsewhere, and you want a break. I have, for example, an acquaintance who is a student of archaeology and history, and he's reading all the time for his studies. And one of the big turnoffs for him for Rogue Trader, despite him being a pretty big aficionado for Warhammer 40k, is the fact that, well, you need to read all the time. So I totally get that. On the other hand, you have the other camp, and I sort of belong to this camp myself. I think there's something pretty interesting, unique, and indeed necessary about written and read exposition, not least of which, again, because it's a CRPG. Now, it should be obvious to anyone that the roots of the fact that CRPGs are written and read go all the way back to their origins, starting in the late 80s and then proceeding to the 90s. Back then, you didn't have a lot of money as a developer. You certainly didn't think about voicing things. This just was not a common thing at all. So you would write dialogue and people would read it. And so that became essentially not just the golden standard, but the standard for CRPGs going forward, up until even now, in 2025. And I think it has a number of benefits. So hear me out. The cold hard truth is that when you voice dialogue, it becomes probably exponentially more expensive. Now, I'm not an insider. I'm not looking at the budget of Owlcat or other companies and developers. I don't know. But it's a safe bet to make that there's a difference in cost between writing 10 pages and then having to read that, and writing 10 pages, paying an expensive voice actor to read it, and then having you listen to it in addition to read it. There's no question there. It's obviously going to be more expensive. And what this can then lead to, potentially at least, I think, is cutting corners and cutting costs. Meaning, look, why would you write the 10 pages in the first place when you can get to the point in 3 or 4 or 5, and you're going to save money too, because that way the voice actor doesn't have to voice all 10 pages. He's just going to stick to the 3, 4, or 5 pages. And so I can kind of see how the trend towards voicing everything could push exposition and dialogue in CRPGs towards a bad direction by cost cutting and basically space cutting. You're losing actual content potentially because nobody wants to overspend on expensive voice actors. Now, another thing that's just basic financial common sense is if you're spending money on one thing, you're probably going to have to cut costs on another thing, meaning there are different types of content you could lose out on if everything gets voiced, because voice actors are expensive. As I said, you have to pay them their money. And so what could happen is, this is just a theoretical proposition, but hypothetically, you could lose an entire character. Now imagine this. You have a character that would have been a companion, and some of his dialogue is voiced, but some of it isn't. In fact, majority isn't. It's like 30% voiced and 70% read. But you had an entire companion with quests, with unique abilities, with a unique story. But because the voice actors are so expensive, you might end up losing out on that particular companion. Or weapons, or classes, or actual story-related content in the game. The vast majority of voice-acted games tend to be more streamlined. They tend to be shorter. Now, you could argue that BG3 is an exception. Of course it is. It's a grand exception. But I think the real risk here is that we could very much easily lose out on content that otherwise would be there were it not for forcing everything to be voiced. Now, I also have, you could say, a final objection, if you want to call it an objection, and that is gatekeeping. I think that genres should be, to a degree, gatekept. By that, I don't mean that nobody should be allowed to play it except me or you or whatever, but I want things to keep their core. I want things to remain what they actually are so you can appreciate them as the things that they are. Now, the thing about Baldur's Gate 3, to get back to it briefly, is it obviously invited an entirely new crowd of people to play quote-unquote CRPGs, even though they have never touched a CRPG in their lives and never will, apart from Baldur's Gate 3, because it was all voice acted, because of the cinematic cutscenes, and so on and so forth. So, if you want the core of your games, in the form of CRPGs, of course, to remain what they are, complex combat mechanics, different classes and archetypes, choice, all these elements that we typically understand to be CRPGs, well, if you end up voicing everything, you probably will end up also having a rather powerful streamline effect. And this streamlining could lead to basically the game that you used to like becoming something that you no longer recognize, because that's just the nature of the beast. When you seek to attract the broad mean of people who are normally not interested in a certain product or a genre, what happens to the genre is it changes to suit their needs, not the minority/small percentage of people who originally had interest in the particulars and peculiarities of the genre and game, i.e. in CRPGs. So these are a number of concerns I would have, even though I totally get the desire for things to be voiced. And what I'm trying to say here is basically, this is not a black and white issue. There are definitely benefits to having everything voiced, but there are potentially at least a lot of drawbacks too. And as I said, I'm not privy to the development costs or what needs to be done, but it seems common sense that if you voice everything in one area, that you're going to probably lose out on content in other areas because of budget constraints and what have you. It's just normal, basic financial common sense. So I don't know. Me personally, I would be perfectly happy going forward with CRPGs not being voiced, apart from some key lines and what have you. And I would remind you, for example, that even Baldur's Gate, the original Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, had just such voice acting. You had certain important dialogue lines that were voice acted. For example, infamously, the famous speech by Irenicus, or Gorion, your warden in the beginning of the game in Baldur's Gate 1. So there are certain basic lines that are voiced, but not everything is and doesn't need to be. That would be the approach I personally favor, because it would keep CRPGs what they are. You would retain the core of the CRPG genre for the people who actually appreciate CRPGs for what they are. Now, if newcomers want to enjoy CRPGs for what they are, as opposed to what they are not, then I welcome them. We want more such enthusiasts, more people who appreciate CRPGs as they exist, but not people who want to change them fundamentally. And I do worry with the voice everything crowd that things could definitely move in a kind of normative slop direction where you barely recognize the CRPGs as such anymore, and they become watered down, and you lose all the things that I mentioned, be it extra content, opportunities for storytelling, characters, exposition, whatever it might be. The written and read word allows for so much more, and it's just much more cost effective. Anyway, those are my 2 cents. I am obviously very curious to see what you have to say about this, because I know that the spirits are very torn on this. Some people definitely want everything to be voiced. Some people are more like me, and I'm sure there's some people in between. So let me know in the comment section what you think. But as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you like my content and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated, as it really helps out the channel. Thank you so much again, and take care.